Now, you know this already, but a ton happened in Russia over the weekend. On Friday evening, the infamous Wagner mercenary group staged what looked like the beginnings of a military coup in Russia. Wagner forces took control of the Southern Military Command headquarters in Rostov, and then began moving north along Russia's M4 highway towards Moscow. By Saturday afternoon, it looked like Wagner were on track to reach Moscow by Sunday morning. But then, all of a sudden, Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, suddenly turned around, saying that a deal had been done to avoid further bloodshed. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Wagner's attempted coup, why Prigozhin turned around, and why, even if he survived this weekend, this is probably the beginning of the end for Putin. We're going to be making a ton of videos on this issue as it plays out in the days ahead, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and all of the other TLDR channels in order to stay up to date. So, what caused all of this chaos to start? Well, the immediate cause seems to be the Kremlin's attempt to fold the Wagner group into the regular Russian army by July 1st. Essentially, following growing tensions between the private military company and the Russian state, Putin wanted to limit the influence of the mercenaries, and most notably, their leader, Prigozhin, by bringing them into the regular Russian army. Now, obviously, this didn't go down well with Prigozhin, who responded to the announcement with a statement saying that while Wagner is subordinate to the interests of the Russian Federation, Wagner troops wouldn't be signing a contract with the Russian MOD because Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, cannot manage military formations. This isn't a new criticism either. For months now, Prigozhin has been criticizing the Russian military's tactics. And while he did avoid criticizing Putin directly, he still definitely went after the Russian army. Anyway, this statement was followed by a weird stunt where Prigozhin visited the Ministry of Defense in Moscow to hand in his notice. And then there was relative calm for a couple of weeks, with Prigozhin just repeating his usual talking points about the Russian army being useless and less effective than Wagner. That was until last Friday night, though, when Prigozhin accused the Russian Ministry of Defense of bombing a Wagner camp. In response, Prigozhin released a furious audio recording to his Telegram channel, warning that him and 25,000 Wagner troops were going to stage a coup. Then, late on Friday evening and in the early hours of Saturday morning, Wagner troops actually crossed back into Russia and entered the Russian city of Rostov, an incredibly important city for the coordination of the war in Ukraine. From there, they directly seized control by occupying Russia's Southern Military Command headquarters. Prigozhin then released two videos from Rostov on his Telegram channel. In the first one, he's talking to Russia's deputy defense minister, who looks pretty terrified, and claims that he's trying to save Russia. In the second, he says that the military command is still functioning, and that Wagner have found documents confirming that the Russian army has lost 3 to 4 times as many men as they claimed. Prigozhin then demanded talks with Gerasimov and Shoigu, warning that, quote, until they're here, we'll stay, block off Rostov, and head to Moscow. In response to all of this, Putin gave an emergency speech on Russian state television, where he accused Prigozhin of treason. Wagner responded to this by saying that Putin had made, quote, the wrong decision, and that Russia would have a new president soon. Not long after, still on Saturday morning, Wagner troops moved north along the M4 highway from Rostov to Moscow, entering the Voronezh Oblast, which lies just 500 kilometers south of Moscow. Now, it's not entirely clear what happened from here, but from the open source intelligence available, it looks like a couple of Russian aviation assets were sent to push Wagner back. But in the end, Wagner shot down at least one Russian helicopter. Now, this lack of real resistance could be down to one of two things. Firstly, it could be that because Wagner has active air defense systems, any airstrikes would have to come from planes flying really high, which would reduce their accuracy and risk hitting civilians on the motorway, which has apparently already happened. Alternatively, it might be that most Russian soldiers are at least reluctant to fight Wagner for obvious reasons. And interestingly, the only group which really seems interested in opposing Wagner is Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechen, who entered Rostov on Saturday afternoon. Regardless, the Russian army didn't just roll over despite the reticence to fight Wagner, with security services trying everything to prevent Wagner's advance along the highway, including blocking the road with dumpsters full of sand and literally digging up the road. But Wagner either bulldozed through or just took an alternative route. In the end, in anticipation of Wagner's arrival, police in Moscow even built machine gun barricades. And air traffic data suggests that Putin fled Moscow for St. Petersburg, predicting their arrival. However, at about 3 p.m. on Saturday, with Wagner troops less than 250 kilometers south of Moscow, Prigozhin suddenly announced via an audio message on Telegram that they would be turning round to, quote, avoid blood being spilled. It's worth mentioning here that when Prigozhin says blood, he's talking specifically about Wagner blood, because while no Wagner troops have been killed, reports suggest that at least some Russian troops were killed during this exercise. Regardless, according to the Belarusian Foreign Ministry, a deal was negotiated by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, a man who's not only friends with Putin, but has also known Prigozhin for over 20 years. And the terms of this deal were disclosed by the Kremlin a few hours later. Firstly, Prigozhin and those Wagner troops that took part in the mutiny will receive legal immunity, and Prigozhin will go to Belarus as a sort of friendly exile for a bit. Secondly, the Wagner troops who didn't take part will be folded into the regular Russian army, as originally planned. And thirdly, there was some suggestion that Shoigu and even possibly Gerasimov could be removed from their posts as Wagner wanted, but this hasn't yet been confirmed. Now, admittedly, there are still more questions than answers here, but whatever happens next, it looks like this could be the beginning of the end for Putin. Wagner's mutiny was a complete humiliation for him, and it's clear that his authority in Russia has been fatally undermined. Rostov citizens even cheered when Wagner forces were leaving and jeered as the police returned. And to make matters worse, all of this will do terrible things to the Russian army's morale, and it's hard to see how Wagner could really be folded into the regular Russian army at this point. After all, they literally shot down Russian Air Force jets, and they got away with it. And not only that, the last few days have made it abundantly clear that Wagner thinks that they're better than the regular Russian troops. In a sense, though, this is Putin reaping what he sowed. If you give a lunatic criminal chef his own private army, which you rely on disproportionately, well, you're asking for trouble. So, that's what happened this weekend. But what happens next? Does this mean that Putin is on the way out? And what does it mean for the war in Ukraine more generally? Well, we'll be answering those questions in the days ahead. So be sure to subscribe to the channel for updates and explainers as they happen. Also, if you have specific questions you want answered about the ongoing situation, then just comment them below and we'll try and address them in future videos.